Many thanks to the organizers of this conference. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to share my research. So my presentation is about the state's underlying principles for governing platforms regarding content. So in other words, it is not about how governments regulate platforms, but why national states govern platforms in a certain way. Compared to specific laws and regulations, underlying principles are more long-lasting and consistent. And they can have profound impact on a country's online content ecology. And in addition to examining the underlying principles, I will further talk about the implications of underlying governance principles for how the two countries govern platforms, how platforms moderate content, and state platform relations. So this is the outline of my presentation. Let's look at the underlying governance principles in the United States first. I argue that freedom of speech, which is enshrined in the First Amendment of the American Constitution, is the underlying principle for platform governance in the country. And Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act is widely held as the most important law that has shaped internet speech and platform governance in the US. As is well known, it provides a double protection, which is the right to moderate in good faith, and also the permission not to moderate at all. As scholars, including Professor Mueller, have noted, the aim of Section 230 is to promote freedom of expression and to encourage internet companies to tackle bad content. So this principle of freedom of speech is also embodied in the missions and principles of American platforms. For example, YouTube states that its mission is to give everyone a voice and show them the world. And similarly, Twitter's mission is to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information and to express their opinions and beliefs without barriers. Again, Facebook's mission is also very similar. So we can see all these three major platforms have very similar missions or principles. They all emphasize giving people a voice or to express themselves. Of course, we can't judge platforms by what they say, but clearly, freedom of speech has been embedded in their missions and content policies. The freedom of speech has been shaping current debates around the future of Section 230 in the US. Both sides, I mean, those who call for reforming Section 230 and those who defend it have resorted to this principle. I will use an American Congress hearing as an example. During the hearing held on October the 28th of last year, Republican Senator Ted Cruz said, and I quote, Google, Facebook, and Twitter collectively pose, I believe, the single greatest threat to free speech of America, and the greatest threat we have to free and fair elections. These were, of course, very strong words. Many Republicans have long accused social media platforms of censoring conservative views. However, despite being criticized for violating freedom of speech, technology companies cited the same principle to make their case for keeping Section 230. As Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey said, removing Section 230 will remove speech from the internet. This argument has been echoed by many Section 230 defenders who warned that holding platforms liable for user content would inevitably lead to over-censorship. Now, let's turn to China's underlying principle for content governance. Existing literature mostly focuses on content censorship in China. And many scholars have tested what keywords may be censored and tried to figure out the strategies or rules behind China's content censorship. The conclusions from previous research are not very consistent. Some concluded that China's censorship mainly target collective action. Others found that there was no uniform or monolithic set of rules related to information controls. What I argue is that public opinion management may be a more useful framework than content censorship in understanding the rationale and underlying principles behind the Chinese state's content governance. This is because public opinion management can provide a more consistent explanation for why Chinese websites, including platforms, censor certain types of content while tolerating other types of criticism. In fact, I think content censorship is only one of the means to the end of China's content governance, namely public opinion management. Let's have a quick look at how public opinion management is embodied in China's relevant regulations and the top leadership speeches. Here, I only give two examples. First, this extract is from a recent regulation, the provision on the administration of Internet News Information Services. 中文就是互联网新闻信息服务管理规定哈 which took effect in 2017. The regulations stipulates that all online news information providers should stick to correct public opinion guidance, plays a role of public opinion supervision, and facilitate and cultivate a positive and healthy online culture. These are common and recurring phrases in China's online content regulations. From this extract, we can see public opinion management is a fundamental requirement for all platforms in China. The principle of public opinion management is also reflected in many speeches of China's top leadership. Here is just one example. In 2013, President Xi Jinping said the internet has become the main battlefield of public opinion struggle. This might be the most important judgment from the top leadership about the urgency in strengthening public opinion management relating to the internet, especially social media platforms. Earlier, I mentioned the mission statements of American platforms. Let's look at that of Chinese platforms, which often use slogans to express their missions and brands. So we can see, unlike American platforms, no Chinese platforms emphasize giving people a voice or providing a platform for expression or conversation. Instead, the Chinese platforms emphasize more of their functionalities. For example, as a WeChat slogan is WeChat is a lifestyle. This slogan emphasizes the platform's diverse and numerous functions. Weibo's slogan is not fancy at all. It highlights discover new things anytime and anywhere. And the Douyin, which is a Chinese version of TikTok, underscores what the platform is for. It is for people to record the good moments of their lives. Although Chinese and American platforms may share many similar technical and commercial features, they clearly have very different missions, reflecting different underlying governance principles. Next, I will briefly discuss the implications of the different underlying principles. First, let's see how these principles influence platform classification and content liability in the two countries. In the US, Section 230 grants online intermediaries immunity for user-generated content. The exceptions to their immunity are very few, including like federal criminal law, intellectual copyright law, child sexual abuse content, and sex trafficking related content. This means even terrorism propaganda, hate speech, and other bad content are all subject to the judgment of platforms. Whereas in China, all content websites are called Internet Information Service Provider and need to apply for a license. Those host news content, they need to apply for an Internet News Information Service license. And since 2017, a new type of a license for communication platforms were introduced, showing that Chinese government regulators started to recognize the necessity of separating platforms from other websites in terms of regulation. All Internet Information Service providers in China are liable for user-generated content. And the regulations have listed 11 types of banned or illegal content, such as jeopardizing national security and inciting ethnic and or religious conflicts. And they also explicitly encourage certain types of content that spreads positive energy and discourage certain types of harmful content, such as clickbait and vulgar content. China's platform governance is categorized as strict liability by scholars McKinnon and others. Now let's compare the content moderation mechanisms of American and Chinese platforms. In the US, the governance model is called self-regulation. That is, platforms themselves set out content standards or community guidelines in moderating user content. As content policies of major American platforms show, the rationale of moderation is to balance freedom of speech and online safety. As for specific moderation mechanisms, as Gillespie observes, to moderate content at a scale, platforms have come to three imperfect solutions, including automatic detection, community flagging, and editorial control. While in China, all content websites, including platforms, are explicitly required to take primary responsibilities or, sorry.
You have about 6 minutes.
Yes, okay. All content websites in China are explicitly required to take primary responsibilities in content management. The state has set a series of specific requirements for platforms to managing their size and user content, such as real name registration, and also establishing the user grading and classification systems, etc. So all Chinese platforms have incorporated these requirements into their content policies. As for content moderation mechanisms, Chinese platforms rely on solutions very similar to their American peers, such as algorithmic detection. But one obvious difference is that all Chinese websites also use keywords filtering in their content management, which has been well known around the world. Okay, so regarding state platform relations in the US and China, the relations between the American platforms and the state are sometimes confrontational, which we have seen in recent years, especially in the build-up of the 2020 presidential election, when Twitter and Facebook suspended the accounts of President Trump, and Trump signed an executive order instructing government agencies to review Section 230. However, we also have seen some cooperation between the state and the platforms. For example, during the pandemic and American censors 2020, so major platforms like Facebook have developed mechanisms to cooperate with relevant government agencies to fight disinformation. Whereas in China, the governance principle of public opinion management has led to what I call a collaborative governance model. And under this model, platforms collaborate with state in shaping public opinion through measures including prioritizing content from state media during significant events or incidents. And also by actively deleting informational accounts, challenge official narratives. Compared to American platforms, Chinese platforms are more compliant. For example, popular platforms including Toutiao, Kuaishou, and Bilibili, they have all issued public apology letters after being criticized by government regulators and state media. However, the compliance in content moderation is mostly in political content. In fact, like American platforms, Chinese platforms also host a lot of harmful content, especially the so-called vulgar content, 低俗的内容, demonstrating the profit-seeking nature of these private platforms, which compete fiercely for attracting users. This can be seen as some level of hidden resistance driven by platforms' economic logic. And last, let's summarize the similarities and differences between platform governance in the US and China. As for differences, the two countries have fundamentally different underlying principles, which leads to a different political logic in content moderation. For Chinese platforms, the collaborative governance model may have contributed to the politicization phenomenon in China, as observed by some scholars. Well, this model has long been criticized in the West as disrespecting freedom of speech, but it seems working well for the Chinese state. According to Washington Post, a recent survey showed that as high as 98% of Chinese they trust the national government. Of course, we cannot attribute this high level of trust simply to the state's effective control of social media platforms, because issues like economic growth and the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic may be more important factors for this high level of trust. However, it does show the Chinese state's platform governance are quite effective so far, and China has also maintained largely stable and peaceful society. As for the US, the principle of freedom of speech is behind the current self-regulation model, and is still shaping the ongoing debates about the future of Section 230. And this principle has led to more confrontational state platform relations in the US, and may have contributed to the political polarization seen in the country. Okay, this is a last slide. So as for similarities between the two countries regarding platform governance, so at the state level, we can see, so both states, they rely on platforms to carry out content moderation at a scale. This forms the new school speech regulation coined by Borkin, which is public-private cooperation in the regulation of online speech. And at a platform level, we can see there are many similarities between the content moderation. First, that both are facing the same problems, like problem of scale, and also they are using very similar solutions to this problem. So such similarities mean that more comparative studies between Chinese and American platforms may be necessary, especially in the context that some Chinese platforms like TikTok have gone global. Okay, that's all for my presentation. Thanks for your attention.